Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Progress America Unfiltered. We've got a super special episode for you today where we are going to be talking about cinema, and I'm not talking about the Arizona cinema, okay? So I've got Jocelyn with me today. I have got Brad, one of our producers. I've got our other producer, Michael, and I have Linda. So Brad, this entire segment and new kind of show was your idea. So can you talk to us a little bit about the cinema we're going to be talking about today?
So this is a sort of concept that we're calling the cinema and revolution. It's about leftist work in film. Film is something that I went to school for. It's one of my first and major loves, and it's combining that with leftist politics is I think something that's particularly fascinating and something we need a hell of a lot more of, quite frankly. There's been a rich history of these kind of movies, so through the next, I don't know, however long, we're going to be looking at some of those, I think, seminal works of leftist film, stuff that's coming out now, stuff that's a lot older, and thinking about how that can apply to our current political landscape. The movie that I picked to start off this series is one called Children of Men. It's one of my favorite movies of the past 20 years. It's by a guy named Alfonso Cuarón. He's the director of it. He has done everything from a Harry Potter movie to two Oscar winners, Gravity and Roma, that he won Best Director for. It's written by Cuarón, Timothy Sexton, David Arata, Mark Fergus, and Hawk Ostby. It stars Clive Owen, Julianne Moore, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Michael Caine, and in the sort of a breakout role, I don't know, she hadn't really done a lot before this, but a woman named Claire Hope Ashity as someone named Key, who is really the key to this entire film. It came out December 25th, 2006. Didn't do great at the box office, but I think its legacy has been kind of surprising because of, I think, how forward-thinking it was, especially after 2016, the stuff that happened then, and the pandemic in 2020. This sort of took on a new resonance. And three on our call here saw it for the first time last night and gathered today to talk about it.
Yes. So I was one of those who saw the movie for the first time. To give a spoiler-free overview, the movie is about a dystopian world in which there's widespread infertility. No human has been born for about 20 years, and you're really faced with the collapse of society. But there is a hope. No spoilers, but there's a hope for the future, and the film is, kind of the journey of seeing that hope through, which was really interesting for me. First initial reactions, when I heard that he was the director, Alfonso Cuarón was the director of my favorite Harry Potter film, Prisoner of Azkaban, I was already locked and loaded, and I weirdly enough saw a lot of stylistic similarities, which is such a weird thing to say, but this is the movie he did right after it, I think. And I think a lot of the tone was really similar, and the grittiness and the reality and the fast-paced nature of the movie was something that I didn't expect to see also in a Harry Potter film. But I really enjoyed it. I think we're going to get into some of the movie's key themes. But first, from our other co-hosts who may have seen the movie for the first time or haven't seen it for a long time, I want to hear from you what your thoughts were. And I think I'm going to start with Jocelyn.
Yeah, so this movie had me thinking a lot about, so as Brad said, 2016, we really started to see more attention paid to the way America treats undocumented people. And that was like a major theme of this movie, with like big grotesque vans saying Homeland Security, deporting people and, referring to people as illegal a lot in a clearly like pejorative way. It was really disturbing because like one of the things I was thinking sitting here, I'm like, yeah, I don't know if this is fully dystopian at this point. This is literally just how major powers treat undocumented people. And which brings me to the ambivalence I have about this genre in general, which it's sometimes, and this is no one's fault, right? This is certainly not the creator's fault. I sometimes wonder if it's unhelpful to view things that are actually happening through a fantastical lens, right? Because if you're not necessarily already informed, it can be like, wow, imagine if that happened. It's like, well, it is happening. It's just, it's not really happening to white people or rich people. So it's easy to, and again, I know that's not never the director's or the writer's intent. It's the opposite, to bring attention to these things. But it's, I think, something as like artists and journalists and creators that, you know, is a tension that never fully gets resolved. Like, what is the best way to talk about these issues? Is it to do it through storytelling, which gets people's attention, but then maybe unintentionally makes it seem unreal? Or is it through reality where people don't really like to hear about it?
I think what sets this apart in a way, in how it uses the refugee community, they're called Fujis in the film, is that they are an oppressed people in this, and the sort of savior that's coming potentially for this broken world comes out of that refugee community. It's not a wealthy white woman who's giving birth to a child that might potentially save the world, as in the nativity story in the New Testament. It's something that comes from a more oppressed people, which I think is very important to this. So it honestly, it presaged a lot of the anti-immigrant fervor in the United States that came out of Trump's run. This was 9 years before that, and it kind of prefaced that in very uncomfortable ways.
Well, I think it also, like, it built on a lot of stuff that was happening in the Bush era, right? Like the Homeland Security expansion of the police state is drawn. There's a clear line out of the Patriot Act, out of the Iraq War stuff. You even see clippings of Michael Caine's character as a Iraq War protester. And, you know, the 2007 was the year after the failed, George Bush's failed immigration reform bill. Because if you remember, Bush won 50% of Hispanics. He was supposed to be like the one who brought Hispanics into the Republican Party, and there was a nativist revolt within the Republican Party led by a lot of the same forces that would ultimately help promote Trump a decade later. But that stuff was all that was all happening. There were giant protests in California, the Day Without an Immigrant stuff. That's like, you know, the early blog years that has like largely sort of been written out. I thought this movie I hadn't seen it in probably a decade. I remember watching it a few times when it came out, I think once in the theater and probably twice on DVD after that. I was working in movie lighting at the time. And I remember, like, when Brad said that he wanted this to be the first movie to kick it off, I thought it was like a weird choice, because I remember hearing people talk about it as a like political thing. But the main things I remember people talking about it were like the super long shots and the like negative fill where they like bring Duvetine just to the edge of frame so that there's like super deep shadows, which I think is like also something they were doing in that Harry Potter movie. And like, I remember the sort of leftist factionalism, the like Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea for the Life of Brian fans out there. And what really like struck me when we watched it last night was how much it sort of relies on the worldview relies on this idea of scarcity, that like the world is going on, but there's nothing coming to replace it. And so it forces people to pull back and think about like protecting what's theirs and not losing it, which is obviously a huge animating force behind all the nativism that happens in the real world. And like so much of what I think about when I'm doing political communication now, when I'm writing emails, is about like this sort of scarcity frame that feeds into the Republican and conservative and fascist ideas of like protecting what's yours and keeping other people from being able to have things, versus like an abundance frame where, you know, we have enough. We're the richest country in the history of the world. And more people coming into this country, just like it did in the 20th century, is more people who can buy all the stuff that we make, more people who can make, more people who can buy, and it can lift everybody up. And I thought it was really interesting how like the lack of a next generation, you know, creates this scarcity mindset in everybody in the movie, where they pull in, even in Clive Owen's character, where he just is super self-involved and can't, see around the corner to what's possible until he meets Key. Linda, you want to go?
Sure, yeah. So it was my first time seeing the movie, but I did go in with some knowledge of the general plot. And it was like different than I expected in a few ways. I knew that it was about a world where everyone was infertile and that it was like a guy who had to protect the one miraculous pregnant woman. But I thought that the politics would be a little bit more clear cut than I thought that they turned out to be. Was sort of going in expecting like a rip roar about, a bunch of brave revolutionaries going up against a fascist government. And I mean, there definitely was a fascist government, but the revolutionaries, like pretty much everyone in this film except for the protagonist, were extremely violent. There was also just a random shot of a bunch of Muslim refugees like firing guns into the air and yelling Allahu Akbar. So I guess that's the Bush era mentality that Michael was talking about, but I really wasn't sure like what exactly was the film trying to say there. Like, just seemed a bit problematic.
I think the Allahu Akbar scene, I think that was a funeral march. They were carrying someone on their body, somebody that had just been killed. They were marching them through. So I believe that's what that was. The politics of it it's definitely kind of fascinating. It doesn't really shake out in a clear-cut way, and with heroes, essentially. There are very, very few heroes in this, except for probably Key and then later Clive Owen's character, Theo. And the leftists in this movie, they're a sort of anarchist group called the Fishes. They're literally at war with themselves, as we see throughout the movie, which is kind of telling for our time as well. Maybe leftists sniping at each other is something that we see pretty frequently. But Tyler, you want to step in?
Well, I definitely think the sniping and the being at war with each other, and something that really struck me is the underlying sexism of the revolution. I think that was a pretty prominent theme that I caught on to pretty quickly. There was a lot of, so when we meet the Fishes, this kind of anarchist or, leftist group that's trying to take on the government, they're led by Julianne Moore's character, name I forget, but, strong, powerful woman with this really commanding presence. I loved her character in the film. She was just so like unique and interesting. And if you've made it this far, listen, there's spoilers already, so whatever. But when she's killed, that was a shocking moment to be like, okay, she was shot. And then to find out that she's killed by a member of her own, one of her subordinates, a member of her own faction, because she didn't, well, it was supposed to be an accident, that kind of thing. But at least that's what I took away from it. Like, he wasn't supposed to kill her, but then he did. And the whole thing was her second in command. Was that what happened?
They were supposed to kill her.
Oh, they were supposed to kill her, yeah. And so like the second in command wanted a more violent means to an end. And Julianne Moore's character didn't. They killed her. Similarly, with the idea that, and this struck me too, when the baby's finally born at the end and the character, Chiwetel Ejiofor, if I'm saying that, his character is like, oh, like this boy is going to save us. And the protagonist is like, it's a girl. And he was like, it's a girl. Like,
he's like, I had a sister.
Yeah, I had a sister.
I've met a girl before.
Yeah, like there were so many moments like that where the women and women in general in this film were portrayed really, really interestingly. And so that was something that I got a lot of. And obviously the film and the book is titled Children of Men. So there's, I think, a lot of specificity within that. But Michael, did you have any thoughts about that kind of motif?
No. I thought it was worth. I wanted to break down a little bit, like building off of what Brad was saying about the factionalism, like really break down what was happening, why they had Julianne Moore killed. Right. So the whole the split within the Fishes seems to be the ones who want to save the world and like start having babies again, and the ones that are trying to build power for themselves internally, right? And so before the movie starts, there's an implied fissure there where Julianne Moore is in contact with the Human Project and trying to get Key away from the Fishes and to someplace where they can like figure out why suddenly she of all people, can have babies, and how is that replicable? And so the reason that they have her assassinated is to scare them away from the human project and the Tomorrow ship, so that the fishes can control the baby, the one baby, and then they have the one thing that everyone wants, and they have the answer. And so it's like a big power move to try to take over that. Whatever, unite everyone under this baby thing. And so that's why they want to keep the baby born on the farm.
And cause the uprising, as I said.
And cause the uprising, right.
I'm going to toss it to Linda, but I do think, too, that's still an interesting way of using women, using women's bodies, and using women's babies to control a narrative and to control an intended outcome. But Linda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I also thought that the role of gender was really interesting in this film. They based it on a book where the men were infertile, but decided for the movie to apparently change the plot in a lot of ways. I haven't read it, but I've heard that. But to specifically make it the women who are infertile. And then, yeah, you had basically a few major female characters in this. Julianne Moore's character, who dies pretty early in the film. Key, who's the pregnant woman and probably the most fully realized woman that we get. And then Miriam, the midwife, who sacrifices herself. But I did think it was an interesting choice on the movie's part, that it didn't feel like there were any characters, male or female, who were just like super driven by wanting to have a baby and like not being able to, and that being a driving force of their character. Like maybe because it had been 18 years and most people are kind of resigned to it at this point, but it felt like it kind of focused on how not being able to have children and not having any children out there impacted society more than it did on how that impacted individuals.
Yeah, and to echo what Tyler said, right? I think about this literally every day. The older I get, when I was younger, like a teenager, I was like, oh, like we don't need to make everything a feminist issue. But the older I get, and the movie does a great job of depicting this, leftist structures, leftist movements almost always replicate the patriarchal systems they're allegedly trying to tear down. And it's a very real problem for organizing because, aggressive, violent male hierarchy doesn't work. It creates all the problems that we're dealing with in terms of like the relationship with each other, with other communities, with our planet. It's a very, and not to be that person, but it really does stem from like all of this Western colonialism starts with Imperial Rome, which was a very patriarchal, very violent, like domination centered way of being with the world. So, when you're talking about like organizing, a lot of it understandably has to come from like, okay, how do we want to organize? How do we want to be different? And if we're just recreating the same way at a smaller scale, that's not, and it does come back to gender a lot, unfortunately, because I get why people don't want to talk about that as much, but it's an important conversation. And yeah, I don't think it's an accident that like the woman is the first one that gets killed.
That's an interesting point. There's a show on Amazon Prime that just started not too long ago called The Power, which is based on a book by Naomi Alderman about women gain this electrical power, which sort of shifts all the gender dynamics in the world. And essentially, it doesn't turn into a slay queen type situation. It turns into a nightmare because those same power structures are put back in place in this gynocracy. It's a slight book. There's not a lot to it. Hopefully the show's going to be a bit deeper as they do more seasons and they kind of flesh things out a bit. But it's a fascinating role reversal.
I love that. And that reminds me of a similar show that I like that explores a similar theme it's based off of a graphic novel series, which if you haven't read it, you should. It's called Why the Last Man. And very similarly to this, well, kind of, but basically one day all men on earth die, except for one, but that's kind of a secret. And then basically the world is run by women. And then what happens? And as Brad said, it is unfortunately not super slay queen. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And so it's really interesting to explore those dynamics. Really quick, one more theme before we get away from it that I wanted to bring up too is also the specificity. We touched on this a little earlier, but when we're thinking about leftist themes and the leftist aspects of this movie, not only was the hope the key to salvation, a woman, she was a Black woman, she was a refugee, a Fuji, as they're called in the film, and a person who we saw the way that the rest of the Fujis were being treated in the film. And so I think that there was something really not necessarily on the nose, but importantly stated by having this young Black woman be the future of humanity and salvation, and seeing the way that her treatment was changed once it was discovered once her pregnancy was discovered to people, and the differences and how people were treated throughout the movie when they were confronted with her.
Not to get away from this topic, but I want to raise an issue. When this movie first came out, it was very much sold around these three major set piece scenes. One of them is 6.5 minutes long. It's in the final act. It's just amazingly put together. Uses all these wonderful tricks. Another one is the scene where Julianne Moore's character gets killed. It's a shootout that's entirely within a car and zooms in and outside of the car. The rigs that they put together to do the shot, spectacular. That was everything that people really talked about when this movie was coming out. Do you think that that took away from the message and maybe resulted in why it didn't do as well? I'll open it up to anyone who wants to hop on that before we get back to Michael.
I think that's a really interesting point, Brad, because I was riveted. I loved the movie, to be clear. Like, anyone go watch it, make sure you're in the right headspace, of course. But, but it is another tension with creatives, right? Like, and this exists in fiction, this exists in music, it exists everywhere. Like, doing really cool stuff and doing stuff that furthers your message or your like theme, those are different things to accomplish. And this is something that I encounter a lot, like as someone who reads a lot with male writers, where it's like, okay, this is good writing, but what you're saying is bad and dumb. And I don't think that's true of this movie, but like, it's a real thing to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that like purity of message is really what drives box office. Like, what is the market for dystopian fiction in 2007 at the box office? Like, as Barack Obama's riding the hope crack all the way to the White House. I think that those scenes, especially the one towards the end, that's like the two long shots where the blood gets on the lens in the war zone, are like, they paint the picture of the world in a really like important world building way that, and it's super exciting, right? Like, having a really exciting action scene to conclude your movie makes a lot of sense. Did it, and it like the super long one shots, they drive home the immediacy. They keep you, in like chained to the perspective of Clive Owen's character in a way that like all the Marvel movies, which I mostly love, when it's just like computers shooting computers and there's giant ships and it's, you really lose track of what's happening. And the stakes are like enormous, and also who cares? So I think, Emmanuel Lubezki, Chivo, the director of photography, who pioneered a lot of these super long shots and then used those powers for evil when he shot Birdman, is, it's super complicated going interior to exterior and keeping the exposure and like close-ups and long lenses and just changing between everything.
Animals.
What's that?
Squibs, animals, all that stuff.
Squibs, animals, tanks, buildings collapsing. And just like from a choreography perspective, it's super impressive. But like, unlike with a lot of with a lot of these showy one shots, wherever the camera landed felt motivated rather than just like, well, yeah, we're doing this in one shot, so let's see over there. Like the planning was really great, and it ends then after all the madness, with like the whole military seeing Key and the baby bazooka, I guess, and that like all of the soldiers are just like struck dumb by the incredible miracle of a baby's foot, and it's just like this common humanity of all sides being struck basic by baby toes, which I found very relatable.
Absolutely. But then I also think something that the cinematography sets up so well is that it doesn't let you rest in anything, which I think is what really struck me about this film. It really grabs you by the collar, in the same way that in the opening scene, he's doing all his stuff, and then, he's getting his coffee. The baby's the youngest person in the world has just died, and we're seeing people's grief. And then the next thing you know, there's an explosion out of just seemingly out of nowhere. You're thrust into that, and then you're just kept along. And I think it's very symbolic in the way that sometimes, especially nowadays, we see and hear and are inundated with so many traumatic and chaotic, and sometimes it feels like world-ending things, and we are expected to just continue on. And especially in that last scene that you were talking about, that 6-minute war shot where there's blood on the camera and everything's going on, and then finally there's stillness, and we watch this beautiful scene of Key, and at this time named Baby Bazooka, soon to be renamed Baby Dylan, walking through, and just peace falling on the people. And like when you think they are scot-free, a shot rings out and you are back into the world, and you are once again reminded through the shaky handheld cameras and the once again picking up the pace that like the world continues doing what the world continues doing. And it reminds me a little what I wanted to mention. It reminds me a lot of what Jordan Peele said when talking about his most recent film, Nope, and the use of spectacle. And there's so many things that are calling themselves in our news cycle today, in our world today, to become a spectacle. And I think this film is kind of ahead of its time in that, taking that same kind of concept that Jordan Peele talked about in Nope. And it really makes a spectacle of itself in certain moments, so that when you get those quiet moments, they're that much more impactful. So when you've got that crazy turbulent shootout in the car shot, and then the aftermath, I think the two of those go hand in hand, and it was really poignant for me.
That ties in beautifully to the third one. I mentioned that there were 3 major set pieces. There's the car, there's the war at the end, and then there's the birth scene, which is obviously way quieter. There's nothing blowing up. It's just Theo and Key. Of course, it's ludicrous that any birth is going to take that short amount of time, but it's like a 3-minute scene, and you feel the pain, and it's almost only close-ups between the two of them, just sort of going back and forth. Then you see the birth, and the baby comes out, and you think it might be dead because it's not moving. And that moment when it suddenly springs to life is one of the most impactful, as impactful as any of the 6.5-minute war at the end.
I definitely agree. And so now we're reaching towards the end of our time. So what I really want to do is go around, this episode is about film and the things that we can take away as leftists from this film. So I would like to hear from each of you. What are some themes that stuck out to you? What are some things that you took away? And how can we fight our own personal revolutions a little better based on, what we learned from what we watched yesterday? I can go first, or if anybody feels called to go. Okay, let's hear you, Jocelyn.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying in the chat, I have a lot of angry feelings about birth in film, but unfortunately that is ubiquitous to and this one was like relatively probably fine. At least she was in pain for a while beforehand, right? As opposed to that typical oh, whoops, I gave birth, silly me. But yeah, I think that the biggest thing for me watching this, and again, to be clear, I loved the movie, zero criticisms, but my biggest takeaway was, to be careful that we're making as much utopian fiction as we are dystopian fiction, because the way the mind works, if you ruminate on despair too long, despair is all you see. And at a certain point, it's well, why would I do anything? I'm just gonna enjoy my life and hang out with the people I love. If intense catastrophe and genocide are inevitable, it gets back to what Michael was saying, which I loved, which is it's very important to not communicate around a scarcity mindset, because that breeds the things we're fighting. But again, 10 out of 10 stars, great movie.
Yeah, I think what I took from it is just sort of the main character arc, which is not revolutionary. It's nothing that's going to set the world on fire, but the idea of moving from cynicism to a sort of belief in something that's bigger than oneself, which is something that I think everyone here has struggled with at some point, something that I certainly have. It gets into some problematic territory in that these female characters are sort of put in his path in order to drive him to that level of overcoming cynicism, which is not great from a screenwriter perspective, but he's the main character, and that's the story that it's trying to tell, using this nativity allegory in a broken world.
5 screenwriters, all dudes. Yeah, I mean, so what I really take away from it is, in a lot of the world building, like, how does the world fall apart? Like, this is the inciting incident for the movie happened, 18 years before, when baby Diego was born, and then no more babies were born. And so, the world falls apart then, as the countries that are left are trying to hoard their own resources, protect their citizens, but also protect their own power. And so you have headlines like Russia nuking Kazakhstan. You don't know what happened in New York that killed Julianne Moore's parents, but it seems like there's just like this tremendous nihilism and like pulling back. And in some ways, like, I think there's a metaphor there about the generations that came before us that sort of built this country using massive public resources, and then have been seeking to privatize those resources and kind of pull up the ladders that everyone, that they climbed up, and they pull up the ladders and they sell them. They're trying to, privatize Social Security, privatize Medicare, privatize all of the systems, roads, all the public goods that we have. People are, trying to destroy them, and we're going to ultimately have to rebuild them, in the same way that if the human project is successful, we will have to rebuild society. Clive Owen has that line on Michael Caine's couch, Jasper, where he says, like, and this is before he knows about Key, it's too late, right? The world went to shit already. So he's really given up, and but ultimately he learns to believe that we will have to put it back together, but that's going to be hard as hell. Linda, what did you take?
So this really, it strikes me as a movie about what would happen in a world where people, and actually like specifically men in this movie, don't value life, like not other people's and not even really their own. And yeah, it just seems like in this world, like violence is ubiquitous because people just don't really care about the death of other people. Like life is cheap in this world. And it made me think about this recent incident where a mentally ill man was beaten to death on the New York subway, actually. Like, it just seems like that was a very small, version of the world that existed in Children of Men, where people just don't care about life. I mean, the men don't. I would say all the female characters really did seem to have more value for life. And then finally, in that scene where the baby appears, it seems to finally make these, soldiers realize, wait a minute, like, life can continue. I actually have a reason to care and not wantonly murder people.
Yeah, and just to echo what Michael said, I think that if we're going to create serious revolutionary art, it has to be art around creativity, because it's way easier to endure than it is to create. And it's, it's like Michael was saying, like, if we want other systems and other ways of being together, it's going to require intense intellectual and emotional courage and the endurance to put things into place that have never existed. Because for so long, we have been a world of colonizers and the colonized. That has been going on for thousands of years, and like resounding brutality echoing between different communities. And if we want to be a different way, it's not just about vanquishing whoever is currently doing all the cruel, upsetting stuff. It's about reimagining a new way to be with power and ultimately with each other.
I love that. I think the things I took away, probably two things. One is that throughout Strife, the most important thing is to remain absolutely human. I think that there was something that really struck me in this movie was, and we haven't even really talked about this, but there was so much comedy in it and so many moments of levity and like offbeat humor that really just popped up kind of when you least expected it. Yeah, there were pull my finger jokes. There were a lot of just when she joked her baby was going to be named Bazooka. There were so many like little moments of levity even throughout these people's darkest times. And that is something I truly believe in. Like, and it seems so like hokey and phony, but like all you can do is like be human. And I think that even in a movie as dark as this one, with such a dark premise, to see people still be able to like find some humor in it, I found actually really interesting, because I do think sometimes as leftists we're like, everything is terrible, like we're all, but it is, but like, okay, and we still have to keep doing the work. So, you know, and then I think the other thing I took is this idea of like planting the tree that you'll never get to sit under the shade of. You know, the movie ends with the protagonist, whose name I have not said this entire show because I have forgotten it. Theo? Is it Theo? Okay. So the movie ends with Theo dying. We all agree that it looked like he pretty much died at the end. He was shot and he closes his eyes, does not respond to Key at the very end of the movie, just as the salvation boat is pulling up. And I think that's something that's really important for me that I think about. I think a lot of people, especially a lot of young people and a lot of older people as well, often sometimes scoff when we talk about the things that it will take, because it's like, well, I'll never see this, or it'll never get done in my generation, or like that'll never happen in my lifetime. And maybe it won't, but like that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And I think that is the thing that I walked away with this movie. We watched this man transform his life, go through hell and high water for the future that he will never get to see. He quite literally dies before he gets to see it. But every single thing he did was still worth it. And it's not less worth it because he couldn't see it. So that was something that I think I'll be taking away from, especially when things feel futile and I need to keep soldiering through. Any final notes from anyone before we wrap this wonderful episode up?
No, it's fun doing the movie with you guys. Let's do it again.
Yeah, if you're watching this and you have any suggestions, or listening to this and you have any suggestions for the next movie we should watch and talk about, let us know. Leave a comment or find us on Instagram and send us a DM at Progress America. Thank you for joining this special episode of The Cinema and Revolution and Progress America Unfiltered. We will see y'all next time. Bye.